Now I'd like to show you how the reformers made such drastic changes to the treatment of mental illness in the 1800s. One of the first reformers was Felipe Pinel, a French physician. He was one of the first individuals to call for a more humane treatment of mental illness, and he did this in the late 1700s. He urged those in power to make improvements to nutrition, to basic hygiene, and to basic living conditions. Up until that point, many individuals with mental illness were being chained to the wall or kept in cages. Pinel called for the removal of these chains. He asked that they be treated more like humans and less like animals. We chain animals, we don't chain humans. He also promoted an early form of behavior modification using rewards and punishment, humane punishment. At the same time that Pinel was active in France, William Tuke was also busy in England doing the same thing, calling for reform. He was an English businessman and a Quaker. That's important because his ideas would spread among his fellow Quakers and eventually make their way to the United States as the Quakers in England immigrated to the Americas. In 1792, he founded the York Retreat in rural England to care specifically for the mentally ill. Like Pinel, Tuke also believed that nutrition, hygiene, and freedom of movement were important to the treatment. The hospital also rewarded patients' good behavior with opportunities to visit with family and friends, to do something fun, to take up a hobby, and to work on site. This is an illustration of Tuke's York Retreat. The patients helped operate the small farm. Their good behavior was rewarded with opportunities to participate in the community, to help with chores, to work on the farm, to go outside and spend time in the sunlight and the fresh air. Thomas Kirkbride was an American physician who treated patients who were thought to have mental illness. In the early 1800s, he was called upon to design some of the first mental institutions. Let's take a look at some of the features of his design, because it eventually became the model for many of the other institutions that would be built in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He believed these institutions should be built in rural communities with a relaxing view and plenty of space for the building itself, but also for patients to be able to go outside and enjoy the sunlight and fresh air. He also made sure to design plenty of space for exercise. The hallways were extra large. There were extra rooms on both ends of the building. Speaking of which, he made sure that the buildings had two different wings, one wing for men and one wing for women. He urged administrators to house the best behaving patients on the top stories because it had the best view. He also urged them to keep violent, bad behaving patients in a completely separate building. In the image behind me, you can see a picture of the institution in Festus Falls, Minnesota, that is based on Kirkbride's design. It was established in 1907. You can see it has two separate wings, one for men, one for women. It is set in the countryside. There are lots of trees around, plenty of space, plenty of grass to mow as well. In the bottom two pictures on the left, you can see lots of windows, lots of space, lots of areas for relaxation and socialization. In the picture on the right, you can see one of the workrooms where the patients work on small tasks and can earn rewards in exchange for their work and their good behavior. Dorothea Dix was an American educator who is probably the most influential of all the reformers that we'll learn about in this lecture. She was able to get legislation passed and contributed to the building of several institutions in the United States. And this is how she did it. In the mid-1800s, she logged more than 60,000 miles, traveling all around the world, exploring different mental institutions. Her goal was to expose the disgusting, deplorable, inhumane conditions in an effort to urge lawmakers, legislators to do something about it. So she documented what she observed. She documented the treatment of individuals who were said to have mental illness, and she shared that information with her elected officials. She wrote letters to Congress. She wrote letters to the president, and she really just kept pestering them until they did something about it. Of course, she had supporters and she had individuals who were on her side, but she was not going to take no for an answer. Her influence on government was able to release additional funding to the treatment of mental illness, to different institutions, and she was able to acquire additional funding for the building of institutions and for the treatment of mental illness. She was also able to get several reforms passed. And when I say she was able to do it, I understand that the legislators were the ones who actually did it, but she was largely responsible for getting everyone on board, spreading the word. She really pushed for it in true social activist form. At the time of her death, she had contributed to the establishment of 47 institutions designated specifically to treating patients with mental illness. The last reformer that I want to mention is Clifford Beers, and he has an interesting story. He was an American businessman who graduated from Yale University. In the early 1900s, he spent some time in 3 different mental institutions. He was a very busy man, his job was stressful, and historians guess that he was probably dealing with some type of depression, anxiety, maybe even psychological burnout. Nevertheless, he spent most of those 3 years in these 3 different institutions. When he recovered, not only was it good news for the treatment of mental illness, he was living proof that treatment was possible, that some individuals with some types of mental illness are curable, but he was also able to document and publish everything that he had observed during those 3 years in those 3 institutions. He published a book that described in detail some of the inhumane treatment that he witnessed. For instance, he talked about how the doctors really didn't seem to know what they were doing. He talked about how the staff members would physically abuse some of the patients. Here are a few lines from Beers' book. You can see he's describing the treatment of a fellow patient. The staff member beat the patient with their fists, with a broom handle, and with their big set of keys. Beers, along with the other 4 individuals, along with many people that we did not talk about in this lecture, all of these people helped make transformational reforms in the 1800s.